Hello, everyone. We're back and we're continuing our conversation on living into inclusivity. And I'm Frances Twiggs, and I'm the rector here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Wenatchee. And we'll be facilitating the conversation for today. So right now, I want to just invite those in our group who are here to give a brief introduction and then just ask that they invite the next person when we've finished introducing, and then I'll come back to me. And so I'll invite Laura to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Laura Shinema. I'm the minister at Cascade Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Wenatchee or East Wenatchee, Washington. Rufus, how about you?
Hi, Rufus Woods here. I'm a columnist for the newspaper, the Wenatchee World, and also a community volunteer, and happy to be here and involved in this conversation. And I'll invite Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave Haven. I'm the pastor at Celebration Lutheran Church in East Wenatchee. And how about Sheila?
Hi, I'm Sheila Marie. I'm associate pastor at First United Methodist Church in Wenatchee, and I'll invite John.
And I'm John Coleman Campbell. I'm the other pastor at Wenatchee First United Methodist Church, just down the street from James.
Good afternoon. I'm James Allgard, and I'm pastor at Grace Lutheran in Wenatchee. And Frances.
All right, so back to me, and just to let folks know where we are. We have been continuing our conversations about race and racism, and using this guide, the Racial Healing Handbook. And we got to chapter 5 in our last discussion, but ran out of time. And so we are continuing this discussion in chapter 5, dealing with applying race consciousness to your everyday life. And that's race consciousness is pretty much what we've been exploring in our group with the handbook, giving us an opportunity to think about and share how, as white people, we can pretty much go through our day not thinking about how being white affects us. You know, we can take for granted just walking down the street or being out and about in society that that we don't really have to think about it. Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color don't have the ease that we have in living out in our world in a predominantly white culture. And so our conversations have helped us to bring this to the forefront of our own consciousness. And so in this part of this chapter, there's some questions that I've asked the group to think about and respond to when it comes to race consciousness. And those questions are, when have we applied race consciousness in our everyday life? If we heard a remark, saw something we realized was racially biased, how did we respond to that? Did we respond to it? How did it feel? How was it received? What are some of those biases we may have witnessed? Comments, some subtle comments. And what are some of the reasons we don't address these comments? And the other part of our discussion that we may be able to incorporate into our conversation is some of us were able to attend a webinar here that took place with the Wenatchee Valley College and their guest, Dr. Drew Lanham, who is an ornithologist, a bird lover, and has written a number of books. And the book that he had read from was The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature. So that's a lot for us to try to cover, and we'll see how we do. And so I will invite John to kind of share with us some of his thinking, and he can invite the next member of the group.
And you wanted me to talk about your questions? I have my own answers. Yeah. Just some thoughts from the chapter 5 that we didn't get to last time. And I don't know if it's a confession or what, but I struggle with some of that chapter. That talks about becoming an anti-racist. And part of my struggle there is I don't know that I like being identified by what I'm not. At least historically, I haven't cared for that. I'd rather have some kind of positive definition of what I am or what I do, I think. Also part of my calling, I think, in ministry and life is to be, as a pastor, somewhat of a bridge builder between different people of different thoughts, persuasions, even beliefs. And I had a quote something I read. A fellow named Zan Holmes was, he used to teach at Perkins Theological School in Dallas. Once said that if you're going to be a bridge, you have to be strong because it means you're going to get walked on. By this, he did not say that people won't respect you and will walk all over you. Pastor Holmes was saying that if you're going to be a bridge, you must be willing to carry the weight, the fear, and sometimes the confused and frustrated navigation of people who are trying to move from one side to the other. People who are bridges sometimes face lack of understanding from people on both sides of the chasm they are seeking to bridge. That is from a man named Justin Coleman. So, anyway, so being, and I, I understand that being neutral or thinking you're being neutral or trying to be neutral can make you appear to not be sympathetic or helpful to, those who are seeking justice and fairness and all that in the world. And I don't want to, how do I say it? I think wrong is wrong. There's certain things I don't want to, be associated with, if you will, or by silence seem to affirm or also. On the other hand, how do I actively work to eliminate racism in myself and the people I work with, come in contact with? One of your questions, Francis, had to do with why we don't do that kind of thing, I think. And certainly there are probably several answers. Fear might be one. Fear of getting hurt, fear of being rejected, fear of whatever. And certainly as a younger person, being around older folks who were quite racist, afraid to call them out on that. Wanting to fit in perhaps would be another reason that we don't do that with whatever group we're in at the time. I don't know, those are some thoughts at the moment. I probably have better ones after I listen to all you. So I'm going to invite Dave to pick up there.
Thank you, John. I'm not sure where to pick up, but I really liked your quote in terms of the bridge metaphor. That was very helpful. And as we, as we think about building bridges, it seems like it never ends. I mean, it's always, I remember driving for many years from North Dakota to Western Montana on Interstate 94, which transitioned to I-90 once it got around Billings, Montana. And the road was always under construction and it was never finished. When finally it was in Idaho, when they finished the last section, I think it was around Mullen or somewhere in there. But even as that section was finished, back in North Dakota, they were starting to reconstruct some of the road so, and some of the bridges across in certain valleys. And so that triggered an impression in me at the time that bridges and roads are never finished. You have to keep working on it. You have to keep anticipating that there's going to be potholes along the way. And I think that's the way it is with our dealing with racism and our trying to raise our consciousness, but at least hoping to anticipate what might come. I like to use examples and metaphors and so forth. And I remember going out pheasant hunting and knowing that the pheasants were going to jump up right in front of me, and knowing as my heart rate was going to leap as high as the pheasants did when they did that. But knowing that I could respond in a more calm manner. And so I think I can use that metaphor as far as when we learn and we educate ourselves and when we interact with people of other cultures and races, and are sensitive to the whatever the case may be, the conversations that we're a part of, we may not be panicking and blurting out things that we later regret. One of the first questions on here was, when have we applied race consciousness in our everyday life, and how did it feel? How was it received? I remember a long time ago, we had a small men's group, and somehow we got on the subject of the Middle East, and one of the participants was referring to people who lived in the Middle East as ragheads. That was his derogatory remark for that group of people. And I had never heard that term before. And it brought me back. I wasn't ready for it. But I did say something. It made me feel embarrassed, even though I had not said it. But it made me feel embarrassed for that person and for the others in the group. So that was the question that Francis posed. How did it feel? And that's how it felt. For a couple others in the group, it didn't seem to matter. I think they were like-minded. My response was, I did say something. I said, I've never heard that term before, and I'd really appreciate if you didn't use that term again. And we talked about that. And I think just by naming it, it was a learning experience for all of us. And we could talk about what names we call people, and how to respond to that. So yeah, that's, I guess, a way to raise race consciousness is to name it when we can. But the problem sometimes is when we're in a group of people, we're afraid to say something because we don't know what other folks are thinking, and we don't want to cause a scene. And it's hard to raise that consciousness depending on the situation. So those are just some random thoughts initially, and I'll throw it over to Laura at this point.
Thanks, Dave. This chapter was interesting. Two things jumped out at me before I get to the questions. One was in her list of the one resource person took them. What's her name? The idea that to distinguish between your commitment to being a white anti-racist and the part of you that wants to be a perfect anti-racist. I think I've struggled with that a lot, of trying to do it right, trying to do it perfectly, and not allowing to mess up and learn from those mistakes, and to just make the commitment and live into it, knowing you're going to make mistakes. That was an aha moment for me. And the other part of it was in doing this work, knowing that there's going to be rejection from people of color, that you can do the work that you think needs to be done, and still, because of the systems that are in place, you can be rejected, not as a person, but your actions and stuff, and not to take it personally, because it's been built up for so many years. And so those are two thoughts that I've carried with me from this this chapter. Well, this past year has given me ample opportunities to practice race consciousness in so many different ways. I think I've mentioned before, last year, taking my oldest daughter, to the airport and dropping her off, and then going up I-5 North and seeing the interstate blocked off, and with police with rifles and stuff, and they were responding to Black Lives Matter protesters that were coming down the interstate, and just having a very visceral response to that, and shocked at and posting it on social media, and the gamut of replies was interesting. Well, social media in itself is a hotbed to have these conversations. And I guess I'll say I had the opportunity to talk to congregants as well as family members that did not see some of the harm that was being done, that the problems with the police force and such. So that was really enlightening. It was, I still have a tendency to freeze up in situations that, like, I need to call people out or raise something uncomfortable, but I'm growing into that more. And those conversations allowed me to take it off of social media and have them with them. So they were uncomfortable. It felt uncomfortable, but at the same time, it felt empowering, because it let me grow some of those edges that were still are pretty rough in talking about this stuff. One of the comments that I hear in our valley all the time, and I really would love to reflect on, what does it mean when we say all the time, we hardly have any Black people here? When I can look around and I can count several Black people, even on my block. And when we're saying that constantly in our own city, in our own town, what does that say? Does it say that we're not seeing them? Does it say that we don't want them? What does it say when we keep saying that? So I wonder about that. Or even the comment that we have no people of color, when we know that's not true. And I agree with John that some of the reasons I've identified of why it's hard to address this is sometimes personal safety, relationships. I know family relationships got tense this past year over some issues and stuff, and we had to take some breaks and stuff. And job security, those are all things that So yes, it's bundled up in that fear that you talked to. So all of those things have an impact. And sometimes even my own ability to articulate it. You know, there, you know something's wrong, you know something happened, but you can't wrap your mind around what actually happened. And that happens to me sometimes too, that I'm kind of, okay, what just happened? And I have to think on it a little bit more. So, Rufus, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I thought I'd pick up on one of John's comments, or maybe a couple of them, and it's the language anti-racist, and my own qualms with this, and for the same reasons. I think he spoke to it very nicely, which is being defined by something you don't want to be versus who you are, and more aspirational language, and that's and so I struggle with that, just for the same reason I don't really like the term anti-bullying, because it sort of emphasizes the bullying, and I don't think it necessarily helps in a context. And I get where it comes from, and I understand the reasons for it, but I struggle, and again, like a lot of things, it's dealing with paradox, right? It's dealing with not this or that, it's both and. And I think about how change occurs, and I think change really occurs when, you know, we're creating a vision for something that we want to create. And at the same time, I think it's important that we're having this discussion, because I think that acknowledging that there are racial differences, and acknowledging the harm that happens, and that the attitudes that exist, I think is important. I've a friend of mine beats me up regularly over, is this really helping, or are you just doing more damage with this group? And God love her, who knows? I said, I hope not, but you know, I think our attention is certainly honorable. And so I can argue this sort of both ways, because part of me wants to say, I'd rather build something that I want to create rather than fight against something. But I also have to, I think the exercise for me is and the practice of looking inward and trying to understand kind of where I'm at, what I've experienced, and really think strongly about what other people are experiencing, because my experience is not everyone's experience, and so I come down precisely on the fence on this issue, and I guess that's really okay, because I think Parker Palmer really describes this best. It's the standing in the tragic gap of where we are and where we know we can be, and I think that's what I kind of feel like this group, and where I'm trying to be. I think we're trying to you know, lean into these conversations. You hope you don't do any more damage, but there's no telling. But you know, you do the best you can in imperfect circumstances. You know, I think applying, like others in this, like Laura, like a few others, applying it sometimes. I can remember times when I haven't leaned into that, and it's sort of like I'm not going to go there. Not really enjoying the conflict that I imagined would be happening, and I think that's part of trying to grow out of that and try to move forward. Not to be, I think, to find appropriate ways to respond, to try to find meaningful responses that don't further that aren't intended to alienate. If they do, well, so be it. But really trying to be very intentional about kind of how I interact with others. And you know, we have a kind of a culture that's, you know, shunning people, and is a real challenge. And allowing people the opportunity to grow, allowing myself the opportunity to grow. I think we could be awfully as a culture, as a society, knee jerk on these things, and so I think the word grace really comes to my mind a lot when I think about this issue. Finding ways to constructively confront these issues, and so those are a few thoughts here. Well, Sheila, are
Rufus?
you? Was that?
Rufus, before we move on, I'm curious to kind of understand a little bit more about what you were referring to with the person that said that we could be causing damage. What, just so we can be aware of it, what could possibly, what are some of the concerns, I guess?
The focus on being on racism and that if rather than building what you're trying to create, a more compassionate world, you're focused on the problem orientation, the concept that if we're so focused on the problem, we're almost reinforcing the problem. The same thing as anti-racist. It's reinforcing that whole. That was the concern,
Okay.
and that was the question, the inquiry.
Thank you.
You bet.
I don't know where I heard this, but it's within the last week about certain studies kind of alluding to that when the subject and this had to do with racism, I believe, but I can't remember where the source was, where all the studies of anti-racism has raised the level of consciousness, but it also has been it has had a negative effect in terms of some people becoming more racist because of the consciousness raising. I think that's kind of what you're referring to, which is like it's a reverse effect. But remain silent, that just doesn't seem to be an option. So
yeah, that's where
if you do, damned if you don't. Sometimes.
Yeah, I think I think we just go with the best intention. That's my thought. But I think what I really, my response to her was, look, this is an individual inquiry. We're looking inside and wrestling with these things. We're not telling anybody how they should think, what they should do. We're merely unwrapping our own experience. And if that's causing damage, well, I'm sorry. Certainly that's not our intent. And I really have enjoyed just the vulnerability and the sort of be able to say, I don't know on some of these issues and exactly, I think I always struggle with the extremes on either end of things. I think that's where the problems are created, and it's not all one way and all the other. It's kind of both. So
I'm just looking at the back of our book that we're working on, and the idea of the book is to have building blocks that get us to that place where we can be creating that community. And the idea that we need to look internally and look at some of the history, look at what our own place in it. Because I know, and I've done this, that I have just barged ahead and tried to go into a situation thinking I knew what I was talking about and really messed up because I did not have the awareness that was needed. So I appreciate that we're being intentional in having these conversations, and I understand the concern as well. So yeah, thank you.
all right, I guess am I off the hot seat now? Okay, Sheila, can you pick up on that?
Thanks, Rufus. I don't exactly know where to begin here. Things that I noticed, things that caught my eye particularly, and I will own that rather than reading Becoming an Anti-Racist in the Real World, I relanguaged to something that felt like I could grab onto it, which is how do I practice inclusivity more consciously in the real world, which is what I hope that means. and have had the opportunity to participate in a couple of transitional workshops on cultural competency as I prepare to move to a new location. And language is the prominent thing that's emphasized. And a simple example, a website, and reading a line, what to expect, and a descriptor of various forms of clothing that might be worn or the way you might present, and a whole paragraph of that then at the very end says, all are welcome. And the comment from a Latina who was conducting that workshop saying, what do you read there? And she happens to be talking to a group that are all Caucasian. And all of us said, oh yeah, come as you are. And she said, so what happens if you look at that from a different point of view? It reads that way to you, that whole paragraph, because you're familiar with all the terms there. What happens if you take the terms out and just say, come as you are, and then maybe describe things and how, so there's a sequence to that and an order to that. And it seems like a simple example, but at those simplest places are places where we can unintentionally, I think, wander into difficult territory, simply not being aware of the language that we're using or holding long enough to meet the person in front of us where they are and listen for that first, if that makes sense. Like just have an eclectic mix of things like that came to mind. I can remember visiting with someone early on when I first came here to Wenatchee who was talking about, my Hispanic does that, lawn yard work and that kind of thing, and just could feel myself go, what? And at the time, just getting to know this person, so not wanting to jump in or correct or ask questions, but my ears were then on for all the places that kind of language shows up in this particular community, and how fiercely I react to that. This is, why not just say you're a lawn care person as opposed to, or lift it up in a different, it was just the delivery. And what I find happening the more we work with this kind of information is, what I hope is a personal awareness of when I catch those things and what that brings up in me, and I will tend to listen rather than react immediately, or it's just because I sometimes enter in and run all over myself in a way that isn't helpful in learning or understanding. And so have learned to hold in those situations and look for opportunities where there's a likelihood of being heard. And I'm going to own that as being concerned about being misunderstood myself or afraid of what the outcome might be, and the work that I feel I can do more effectively in that space. In answering the questions, questions in the reading itself, a time when someone said something racist, I can remember in high school, my stepfather didn't really say much about those things until I said I was going to Drake University for pharmacy school, which was a third Black, and Dad, right just out of the blue, said, you can't go there. Sorry. Because there are a whole bunch of Black people there. And I just had no frame of reference for that. He was a little bit more derogatory in his description of that. And in the moment, I attempted to just course correct and say, well, Dad, it's about school, just floundering as a 17-year-old. And set it down in the moment. But the next time that kind of information or that kind of presentation came up, the older we get into our 20s and of course know everything. And so I challenged my father, and that shut down conversation for a while, because there just was no, and what I can see in retrospect is I had no idea what his frame of reference was. I didn't have the language to speak into that. And I offer that example because that feels like what we're talking about here in a different context. I've had training as a chaplain where the practice responses that are in the book, tell me more. Gosh, I understand that from a different place, entering from a place of curiosity rather than all-knowing or opinion. And I hope that's where I am learning to lean in And again, freely own that that's not always an easy thing to do. Sometimes my best response is about 10 minutes after the conversation, where I go, could have done that differently. And I hesitate to say better or worse, because it really is, Dave alluded, it's something that we're always doing. We're always learning these things, and not just in this category, but any category. And so a little bit of grace, I think Rufus mentioned, to just own where I am, I'll speak for myself, and really just continue to work at awareness. And particularly for me, this comes up, as I said, in language. And the comment I wrote at the end of all of these suggested practice phrases and things is a very Wesleyan statement that we know as United Methodists: do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. And I would say, to the best of your ability, as ever you can. And that's kind of where all of this sits for me. And with that, I'll invite James. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, you guys. There's just so much wisdom. And I think, I've been reacting or reflecting with some notes as we've been listening to one another too. And I wish that I would be able to lift up times and moments where I have been a better advocate for inclusion, perhaps in a more public way, maybe. But I think I rest on the convenience of my position, quite a lot. So, but it doesn't mean I don't have something to share here though either. So I was thinking about, in particular, Rufus, when you were bringing up the gal who had been expressing some concern about just delving into this topic, the challenges of this topic. And that reminded me of something that has more to do, I guess, with like organizational design, or how we put our ministries together as pastors, or church leaders. And it's just a kind of a simple phrase, and that is to say something something will grow as long as you pay attention to it. Like, let's say it's a small group ministry or prayer ministry, or how you do worship or things like that. So something grows when you pay attention to it. But I also think that when it comes to racism, it grows when you ignore it. And so I feel like, in a sense, I'm kind of left in a bind, because it grows whether or not I'm a complicit participant, or an active participant, or an anti. And I think that we're still in the midst of the fallout of the problem. Now, I do know that there are moments of healing that happen through relationship, but I think that it's still a very kind of jaded and rocky path that we're on as a whole community. So when I know that I've been complicit and just more silent than is responsible for myself, I know that at the same time, I'm also asking the victim of racism to in a sense, pay the emotional rent for my complicity, to bear that. And so it's probably a very human thing to say, which is, I would rather you feel pain than I feel pain. And in fact, I would go another step farther and say that when it comes to issues around inclusion and racism, in a sense, I would rather be less feeling, or even perhaps unfeeling. I feel like I would rather be numb to it than to actually begin to feel the feelings that are around it. And so that means that I kind of, in a sense, put an emotional shield around myself, which means kind of stepping lightly, or tiptoeing through challenging conversations or experiences. And so what I'm hoping then is, if I give myself more permission to feel the feelings, I would hope that I'm met by grace or forgiveness or understanding. But I can't also, I can't put that on the other either. It's not a guaranteed. And so it makes me feel like I'm kind of on a shaky ground, because feelings of guilt, feelings of shame would come out, I think, if I gave myself more permission. Um, so some comments that I've picked up on in general here in this valley, especially through last summer, for example, with the riots and protests and um, some violent ones, is that we live in a very insulated area. And then all that stuff is happening over there, and aren't we glad we don't live over there? Even that has its own subtle um, way of getting ourselves off the hook, I think. When we first moved to the area, the housing market was tight like it is now, and there were many folks in the congregation and others who just simply asked, are you going to rent for a while until you get to know the town better, making a decision of where to buy? I suppose I could interpret that in many different ways, but knowing a little bit more about subtle effects of racism, I think that there's a piece of that also. You don't want to accidentally buy a home in an unsafe part of town, right? So I guess I picked up on that just a bit. So some of the reasons why I wouldn't want to address comments, especially if it's in a public setting, I don't want to make somebody else a public spectacle. It's really important to me to respect the dignity of the other, even if they may be messing up. Maybe there's another way to be in that. And I also don't want to appear or be holier than thou, as if I'm a person who has arrived. Let's see. I think that I'm not saying that this is right, but I think that in practical terms, labels are an efficient way to move through life. Oh, those Swedes, for example, right? Oh, those Canadians, all they do is watch hockey and drink, right? I mean, it's a playful thing to say, but it's steps down a path toward discrimination, judgment, prejudice, a way of lifting your own self up above others in order to feel more superior. All of that, I feel like, is part and parcel of the territory, the culture that racism really breeds and feeds in. But I also think that the need to survive is a biological one. And so I'm thinking that there are different parts of our own brain, our own minds, that are used depending on how we are through a situation. And so I think my hope is that I can move less into the reactionary side of my mind and more into the cognitive way of being, so that I can realize that my own survival is, I'm not as at risk as I think I am. You know, I think that that's a really big piece. I'm really not as at risk as I think I am. Yeah, I also think that um, I mean, I wrote this note, and it might be something to just for me to just ponder more, but I wonder if we live in a very permissive culture that has a whole lot of unwritten rules. Um, and so we've got this blend of being both permissive and you definitely can tell when you are misbehaving because you're operating out of the norm or out of the box because of the reactivity that you feel around you. So anyway, I don't know what that necessarily means, but you know, I wrote my own note down and I'm thinking, well, maybe I can think about that for a while, because we don't really communicate as a larger community what our desires are for sharing community, even on an emotional level. Those are tough. It's like practicing a new paradigm, I feel. Um, so I feel like I'm just kind of spinning around in the midst of it. So thanks for hearing me. I think Francis, right? You get to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody. Gosh, as I was reading through chapter 5 and this last piece of it, I reflected back on my life and reflected about how I've engaged this conversation in different ways, from from a young kid in the midst of the South and all that, and in the midst of the civil rights movement, and thinking to myself, I've come to this stage in my life where I feel as though I've become more comfortable uh, with not engaging the way I did when I was younger. I would push my friends. I would say, you said this and this is, I was very, very, I guess some might say confrontational. And that went through college, that went through in the Air Force. And then I look at my stuff, I think, well, I feel like I've been resting on my laurels. And so in some respects. So when we began to engage this conversation as a group and coming together and having this conversation, I looked at this as a means of, and Rufus, I'm kind of coming to that question that the person posed to you, as a way of how can I hold myself accountable? How can I re-engage, what's been going on in these past few later years of my life, and how can I get some others to help me be accountable? Because that's, for me, that's what this is kind of all this internal reflection is about, is to hold myself accountable where I can do that. And so that's what I would say. And this group could have done this without being public about it or not. We decided in a way to say, hey, let's let folks in and watch us fumble around with each other. And also try to be conscious, hold this up in our conscious, and because we do have that privilege of being able to let it go. I will always remember the conversation I had with a coworker before I came into ordained ministry. I was just working at a government job, and I don't know, he was Black, and we've had other kinds of conversations. He had the desk across from me, and maybe I was talking about, oh gosh, I went into this kind of fancy store and I had all the grubbiest clothes I could have and on me, and it was Christmas time. There were lots of people in it, and I was in there for a long time trying to find the right gift. And eventually I noticed this guy in a tie. Whenever I'd move, he'd move. When I'd move, he'd move. And he was suspicious of me. I realized, oh, he doesn't, he's suspicious of me. And I was sharing that, and this guy said, imagine how that you'd feel if that happened every time you went into a store, every single day, every single time. And that was that sense of, okay, I experienced this one time in my life that I can think of, being aware that somebody was suspecting me of being a shoplifter. And so that's where this comes, this conversation, this group. And so there's times when I say, I could say when I pointed something out, there were a lot more of them in my youth than now. And where does that come out of? A lot of us have already named it: fear, worry of our, job security. Doesn't mean that I'm not saying, I often will preach social justice and racial justice. That's different than, the one-on-one when you want to be a part of a group. And you want to be, and you're trying, and we're trying to balance on a line. It's and so I often slide. I know it. I know I slide. And I also want to be able to engage in a way differently now than I did when I was a youth. I don't want to come across or be that kind of in your face confrontational, because mostly what happened after I did that is I was shunned. Don't, talk to Francis about that, because. And so how effective was that then? So trying to come to a place where I can listen and if I hear something and find another way of asking a question, what does that term mean to you, or how, something to try to get into a conversation as opposed to a battle.
I think Sheila said it right. I mean, I really appreciate a sense of wonder and curiosity, right? And bringing that versus judgment. And of course, my mind always wants to go to judgment. That's just kind of how my mind tends to work. I mean, one of the things that I've been reflecting on this chapter and these questions, the racist comments are not very overt. What I tend to see more often is denial there's a problem, or that was then and I had nothing to do with it, right? That I treat everyone with respect. I'm colorblind and all that. And I think, to me, those are, and finding the appropriate venue to respond to that as a constructive. Kind of constructively engage with those questions. I think for me is the art where I'm trying to lean into it more. that there isn't a level playing field. If you've experienced, if your family for 150 years experienced, 150 years plus, experienced various slights and economic impacts and the lack of opportunity and shunning and so forth, that has a cumulative impact. And I think we heard that in Drew Lanham's discussion, and that to me, that's the work that I think that, I mean, I think this is important work. I'm glad we're doing this because despite my friend yelling at me, she's not yelling at me, but she's questioning me, and that's good. I think it's worthy to discussion, to just at least question, is this the right approach? But I really believe that whole consciousness piece, which is about just being aware. I just wasn't aware, and it takes a mental discipline, a consistent mental discipline like this group, I think, to really start to unwind some of those things and see what's happening around you. I know I see it myself now, and that raises the uncomfortable specter of, okay, what do I do with this? And how do I, appropriately and effectively and honestly and courageously step in when I feel like I need to step in, and rather than just not say what I'm really thinking. And so I think this is a work in progress, because I'm not there yet, and I have a lot of work to do. But to me, it's I just just trying to keep that in my mind. I can't remember who said it, might have been Drew Lanham, may have been someone else who said preferred the term advantage rather than privilege. Privilege is kind of a loaded word, but advantage, I don't have to worry about those things, right? And that's not the experience of people who are of color, and that's the reality of it. So anyway, I wanted to.
Rufus, you use the word curiosity, and I think that's generally a good word. But I think I've messed up times when I was curious as well, that, dealing with people, my curiosity, which I think was sincere and honest, and although may have made that person feel like they were different, and different means maybe not belong here, not, something like that. So how do I have that curiosity without offending someone?
I wonder if humility is a piece of that as well, so that you enter with humility and curiosity, and trip anyway. At least that's my experience, but with a level of humility that says, I just really don't know, and so I'll ask and see where that takes us.
And there's also this sense of, gosh, I mean, there's always going to be someone who will be hurt or offended, if we want to use that, to say that term. I remember years ago writing an essay for a seminary professor, and, in my, saying, I don't want to do anything that will hurt anybody. That's my, big concern about being a pastor coming into this priesthood. And in the margins, I wrote, if you never want to hurt anyone, you won't be doing much of anything. I was like, oh.
Well, and to allow space for all of those elements, instead of right or wrong or this or that, just to allow the space for that to be a reaction and mine to be a reaction, and so on and so forth, as opposed to laying another layer of, oh my gosh, now what have I done? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but there's space to just meet and have conversation without necessarily, maybe there isn't resolution, but there's conversation and an opening and a place to begin to dispel or work at some of the things that are in front of us.
Something, a lot of what go ahead, Laura, and then I'll respond after you speak, because you were on.
One of the ways that I got tripped up in my curiosity was asking about people's stories. And I think what I learned at that time was to check my expectations. Am I expecting that I deserve this person's story? That, just because I think it's curiosity doesn't necessarily mean it's okay. And how often, and we've talked about this before in our conversation, how often people's personal stories have been used against them in some of this work or in some of these cases. So when you talk about being tripped up by curiosity, John, yes, most definitely. That's where I've gotten caught and had to learn. And I think it's more about what you're saying, Sheila, is meeting people where they are and them giving you permission, whether they want to share their story with you or not. But you have to meet them and you have to be vulnerable yourself. It's not, okay, just tell me your story. I'm going to sit down and listen to you.
And
Yeah, I
being
think that
willing to accept that response. Yeah.
I think it's also that it's not just tell me why you think that way, but it's really about, well, tell me more about, curiosity to me is trying to understand where they're really coming from. I mean, you can say they're upset about X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, tell me more. What do you, really, can you clarify for me kind of what your concern is, so that you're not jumping to an assumption of this is what it must be. I'm really good at making up what I think, what I think they're thinking. And sometimes I'm way off base. And so I think just having the discipline to not just jump to a conclusion. And I know I can do this, but to, just be willing to probe there a little bit and see, again, all by permission, but if they're willing to express an opinion that seems, maybe counterintuitive to me, I think I think it's incumbent upon me to say, yeah, talk to me more about that, because I'm not sure I'm following you, and using that as an opening to a conversation.
Dave?
I just was gonna, this kind of goes way back to a previous part of our conversation, but the term respect came to mind in terms of even power differentials, where our perception as people that basically have white privilege is we have the power. And so there, and so I'm going to talk personally about I guess when I was probably in about the 8th grade, and I was having a conversation one day about with a classmate about the teachers we had, and the teachers that we respected. There was no discipline problems, there was no nothing, but the ones that we perceived were weak, we pounced on. We were not good students. We went in and made life miserable for those teachers. I wish I could apologize now for that. But there was this sense of, it was a form of bullying from the students, from our perspective towards the teachers. And it was pointed out, in our conversation that, that was this power differential that we had. And I think there's something to that in terms of our race relations, that there's a perception that we have a certain power, and so the respect or lack of respect for another culture plays into our responses and our interaction with those cultures or races or whatever. And to have that pointed out to me in that conversation was like, oh yeah, I was a bully. I was being disrespectful, and that had not occurred to me. I thought it was funny. I thought it was just having fun with my fellow 8th grade boys, picking on a teacher. But no, it was bullying. So, that's how many years later when I realized that. So that perception of respect, I think that RESPECT, you know, that song, it has something to say to us. That's, yeah. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything we're talking about, but it has to do with respect.
Yeah, I think that's so. I think that's what we're all striving to be. In our baptismal covenant, we have a line that says we will respect the dignity of every human being, and we respond, "I will," with God's help. And so, and that is another piece that we did some work with, is how the work this person does in a workshop has to do with dignity. And she pretty much says, you all know when your dignity has been trod on, when your sense of dignity, your sense of worth, your sense of, you know, and if you can tap into that, if you can tap into your own experience of having had somebody trod on your sense of self and dignity, that is how we can enter into empathy for the other. And it doesn't matter, you know, and another person says, check in and find out what the impact is of something you said with somebody else. You may not have meant it, intended it, but what was the, get to a place, if we can get to a place where we can say to somebody, I just want to check in, what was the impact for you? So that gives them, it says to them, it was your dignity. If we feel our dignity has been violated or stepped on, that's for us to be able to claim without somebody saying, no, it didn't, you know. So yeah, thanks for reminding me of that.